Oh, hello, friends. David Bose again. Huh. Yeah, it's a little later in the day, so this video will probably get out quite late. Had to go into town and still doing my taxes and stuff. Oh, what an ordeal. But I want to get right into this video because we left off at a very precarious place yesterday. I think we were getting into some very good stuff. And you probably wonder, well, why hasn't somebody explained this before? Because, well, first of all, I think when people look at the Bible, they don't really understand it. But they don't allow themselves to understand that. They don't allow themselves to admit that. Because from the very moment, as Christians, from the very moment, this is holy. This book goes back thousands of years. So tradition places it alongside government. You don't question that. You don't when you're born into the world, there's several things you don't question. You don't question your mother's authority, your father's authority, because they can whoop your ass. And that makes so much sense. I'm a little kid and I can't feed myself. So those are things that I think are natural. But when you ask your father and mother, and for instance, if you ask your father and mother, why do I have to go to school? Why do I have to work? Those are natural things too, because, well, honey, if you don't go out and get the firewood, we're going to get cold. So that makes sense. And you're a human. You're a human. So, we're pretty intelligent. We get that. We get all these things we could just naturally understand. But then there's these questions. Well, mommy, why do we believe in this God and half the world believes in another God and the other half in another God and the other half in another God, and they think we're all going to hell and we think they're all going to hell? And, well, it might not be that simple, but now there is something that, now wait a minute. If the prying mind or the honest person, the honest heart, wanted to stop and ponder that, he'd have to stop and say, wait a minute, I can't just accept the fact, accept it as a fact that my holy book is more important than their holy book, unless I've read it and there's something very compelling, I should say. So you look at the Bhagavad Gita and you say, wow, this is pretty interesting. A lot of parables. Doesn't really, it's kind of like somebody from the country, Hank Williams Jr., right? He's not going to probably get into rap. It just doesn't follow. He wasn't raised that way. So you're going to look at it and you say, well, I don't know who this Krishna is or Vishnu or something. I don't understand these parables. I didn't grow up with this. We don't believe in those things. Nirvana, why, that's ridiculous. Because you don't understand what they be like. If you'd never heard of Einstein's theory of relativity, and it may not be true, I'm not trying to say that for you, those of you who don't believe in that, I'm not saying that we know that that's a theory. But the point is that scientists believe it in the West. But if you believed in creation or something and somebody told you that there is evolution, you would have a hard time. So there are things that we cannot readily accept without doing some serious research. And it requires sometimes taking away some of our preconceived ideas. Now that can work both ways, because today we've got misinformation. So there's people that are trying to say, hey, young man, why do you believe in that Bible? That stupid Bible. This is ridiculous. You shouldn't believe in that Bible. Wait a minute. You were deceived to start with by Catholics and, bishops and cardinals and popes and edicts and grand councils and stuff and anathemas that you must obey their interpretation. And you probably didn't like it when you were taken to the gallows or, crucified or tortured because you didn't, perhaps you had a different religion. But it doesn't follow then that just because those people taught those things, and you can't really find those things in the Bible, I mean, it's completely the opposite of what Jesus taught. So you can't just say, well, then I don't believe in the Bible, because for 1,000 years it wasn't even translated into the common language. People didn't know what the Bible said. They listened to a pope or something. Oh, the holy book behind the glass window. Don't touch it. Don't read it. We're the interpreters. And we say, off with your head. And so that doesn't mean that we can just, for those, a lot of people today, they're just secular and atheist and agnostic and so forth. Modernists. They just out of hand reject it. Now do some research, you'll find that same stories that's in the Bhagavad Gita that we mentioned, it's actually same exact stories that the Greeks tell. You've got Zeus, Theos in the Bible, or Uranus, Jesus' father. In Greek, it's Uranus. And the Titans, the angels that are thrown into Tartarus, into thick darkness with, they're chained down there in hell. You've got the key, the god with the key to the bottomless pit. That's Hades. He's got the key. Poseidon's got the trident. You've got the father of the gods, Jesus' father. So you've got all of the same things. And as most of my subscribers know, we've gone into that deeply, and we've found that the Bible is parallel. And we found out that all of the ancient history and mythology and stuff, it's talking about something pretty interesting. It's an esoteric wisdom that is deep. It's astrology, it's prophecy, it's something. It's something. We got to figure out what it is, because every nation on the face of the earth has believed it, and there were those who tried to hide it. We found out yesterday that the people who wrote the Old Testament, or who cherish it and believe in it, in their own book, they say we must erase the memory of Amalek. But nobody ever tried to figure out why. And so, what we want to do today is be very honest, and then come to the conclusion, if we can. I don't know if we can do it in one more video, but we've been doing this for what? Counting 2,000 videos or something, and we're still talking. Because there's still more to learn. We have to grasp it. It's very hard to... Why would it be so hard to grasp if it's the truth? Well, it's parables. That's not good enough answer, is it? Because there are some things that just don't make any sense. Even if you're looking at it from the point of view as a parable. Let's just get that right up front straight. There are some things that don't make sense. Let's say you say, well, Dave, I don't agree with you because I got a scripture over here that proves you're wrong. That God's got to be the true God. I found a scripture in the New Testament that says it is. Okay. Let's say you could find one. I disagree that there is any, but there might be, I would say, 2 verses in the New Testament that would cast any aspersions, I should say aspersions, upon my interpretation, shall we say. Not mine, the interpretation we've been discussing. The one that says that Jesus came to the Judeans 2,000 years ago at the lowest place on earth, the Dead Sea, got baptized and went under the lowest river, the Jordan, and said, if you go down there 7 times to the man who is blind, you'll still see. And we talked about how that's a parable, about going down into the depths of these vibrations, these flowing waters. The depths of the emotions is in the water. And we talk about how the astrology has a circle, and on top's the sky. And then there's the horizon. And then below that is the winter and darkness. And there's a sea down there, a bottomless pit. Scorpions and Sagittarius with, Cyclops and horses that got faces of men. And then the great sea beast and Pisces and Aquarius. And, oh yes, don't forget Capricorn, who looks like Pan or Satan with 2 horns, clawing his way up through the sea until they get to the horizon, and the sun rises from the east and shines all the way into the west. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. And it is the story of all of the nation, Jason and the Argonauts. That's what that story means. Zeus, and his thunderbolt, and his brother Poseidon with the trident, and Hades with the key that had the Titans in the bottomless pit, and he's angry at, this god Hades is angry and keeps us down in hell. And Zeus has got to somehow save the world. And all of this story. Well, now, if you read the Greek mythology, it's not like some of the gods are gracious and kind always, and some of them are so there is something different about the Bible, because it's a little more consistent. A little bit more, although I'm not sure that it's always, especially in the Old Testament, it's not that consistent. Because as we said, this Yahweh seems to have two characters. Well, he even says in Isaiah, I create light and I create darkness. So, nevertheless, I've never ever said to you guys that somehow or another you could, when you identified these characters and what's really going on, that somehow by that time you'd understand it. Because nobody's going to say that Zeus having some sexual relations with Rhea on the earth and raping her is somehow you're going to, okay. Somehow after you've interpreted that to mean, to say somehow that heaven and earth can create air and plants, and finally down the road is born, Thoth or wisdom or logos or mind. But yet we've also said that so no one's ever understood any of this. I mean, Ovid wrote a book, Dante, people have painted pictures. I mean, we've got, Michelangelo and all of these Pisani and Teniers and great composers and Bach and Beethoven and all of these scholars and scientists that used this wisdom and ended up coming up with calculus and how far it is to the stars, and goodness, where do we end? What we don't realize is that today our chemistry is based on alchemistry, or alchemists, which was, scientists used to be religious people. They studied the Hermetic wisdom. They were in occult wisdom schools. They taught in the mystery. Pythagoras was a mystery school. Socrates and Plato, they were involved in a mystery school. Pythagoras got it from Thales and so on from Egypt. Ptolemy and the libraries and all of the wisdom, and Alexander, who was taught by Aristotle himself. The great kings used to be philosophers, and they prided themselves on knowledge and wisdom. And in Athens, they had all these stories, these mythologies. Well, Athenia was born from one of the gods, right? The whole Caesar and all of his, all the emperors from the beginning of Romulus, they were all descendants of the gods. What is that, some kind of mythology? Well, they were great philosophers. They didn't really believe. They didn't really I mean, do you think that the people of Samaria or Egypt that built these great pyramids and understood how many miles it was to the stars, they identified stars that we don't even know how far it is or where, we didn't even know until recently that these stars existed. That they had wisdom, calculus, and information and knowledge and ways to build the pyramids that we couldn't do. That temple, that great pyramid, is absolutely level after 10,000 years of standing there. It's never even budged. It's perfectly level. Covers 13 acres. So, these great thinkers were studying Aristotle in school today. Aristotle had a mystery school that he got from the priesthoods. And Jesus taught in the priesthoods. He had a school. That's why he was a teacher. He carried on for John the Baptist, who carried on for Elijah. And these were schools. These were mystery schools. And we have been fooled about what that Bible is. It was literally kind of like a Reader's Digest version of all the ancient mysteries and wisdom. But in that story, they put it down as two testimonies because they wanted to explain it that way. Don't ask me why they did it that way. But that's how they understood it, because we had first the bottom of the wheel that we had to go through, and then we go on to the top of the wheel. We have left and we have right. We've got the male, we've got the female. This is how they explain it. And both are necessary. It's a sacred science. You would have to, I couldn't explain to you, or even perhaps could anyone ever understand or know all of the ins and outs and depths and eccentric details of all of this wisdom. To study it from Manetho to Herodotus to Pliny and Plutarch, and all to just literally read all of the great philosophers and scientists, and read it all, and all the great works, and the Bhagavad Gita and the Book of Thoth and the Nag Hammadi Library and tablets of Samaria and Babylon and Acadia, and learn all of their ancient wisdom and all of their truth. But what we find is a thread throughout all of it. And we can't just close our eyes and be blind. There is something in the New Testament is not the same as the Old Testament. And that makes sense because that's the old and this is the new. We described yesterday how there is something underneath the stories. It's trying to tell us something as it explains how this God Yahweh comes down on this mountain with this thick gloom and darkness, and he starts pronouncing all this, I am God and that is my name, and I am a God of vengeance and don't cross me, I mean, we just never noticed that wasn't the father of Jesus. But here's the problem. Just as the New Testament has a verse or two that's hard to understand, once you decide that God is love and you begin to say, I see God is love and everything's wonderful. Well, that doesn't end the matter, because then you look at the world and you say, then why is there suffering? There's always something else to consider. Well, that's what the Bible's about. And you look at the book of Job, it's discussing that very problem. And then the answer it gives isn't very clear. It seems as if all of human history has been all of this history that we've written down, all of the scientists and all of the philosophers have been trying to figure out this one question. Who are we? Why is there suffering? Will we live forever? Where did we come from and where are we going? Are the gods real? Is it an allegory? There's a lot of things that we need to answer that no one person has ever answered in the history of man. That we can't expect to answer all those questions, maybe perhaps in our lifetime, but certainly not in 1 or 2 videos or even 1,000 videos. But what I believe we can get to the bottom of in this video, or in a collection of videos similar to this one on this channel. That's what we're trying to get to the bottom of. Is there really a revelation once and for all delivered unto the saints, given by the holy apostles and prophets, that the angels desired to peer into? Does it really spell it all out? And what happened? Why is, if they gave us that revelation, what happened? How come we lost it? Well, we see in the New Testament a vague idea that Paul's saying he's struggling very hard to try and get people to not go back to the law. Even today, you've got to try and explain why we shouldn't go back to the law. I mean, this is so difficult. Well, then maybe Paul's not even a prophet. Maybe he's not even an apostle. My goodness, if he's going to say that we can't be under law, well, then we'll just probably have to throw him out. Well, then what do? You throw out the entire New Testament, because the Apostle Paul wrote most of the epistles. The only epistles he didn't write is 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, and the book of Revelation. He probably didn't write the book of Mark, although Mark was one of his scribes for a while. But he was also Peter's scribe. So we assume, and the tradition is, that Mark was written as someone who was an eyewitness with Peter and Christ. That Mark was there, or at least Peter was there, saw the whole thing. So Peter told Mark what to write. Luke was an independent writer, but he was a companion of Paul. And so when Luke writes the book of Acts, half of it's about Paul, and half of it's about the rest of the apostles, but he includes Paul in there, and he definitely tells us that Peter, James, and John, and all the apostles and brothers and elders that were there at the great council at Jerusalem, they all were one accord in the idea that we're not under the law. And they gave Paul and Barnabas a letter stating that, to take to the circuit of churches in a circuit. The ones that we know about up in Asia Minor and up clear up to Rome and Colossae and all these things in Ephesus. Well, Peter and other apostles, like, certain apostles went to India, and we don't have their works, some of them. We've dug some of them up. Some say the Nag Hammadi library is that kind of thing. Testimonies from other apostles. We've got the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, who was the apostle to the apostles. But there's a lot we don't have. But the point is, when you look at the New Testament, you have to accept it. And when you look at Paul, he more than alludes, he explains very clearly in simple language. If you understand math, 2 and 2 is 4, you can't get around that. You may not understand the calculus over here, but if I tell you, well, listen, you may not understand this calculus, but I'm going to tell you first, to start off as a foundation, let's go. This is what I'm going to teach you. There's 10 numbers. Now count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 10. And 2 plus 2, see, we take 2 blocks and 2 blocks and put them, and we got 4 blocks. That's the foundation, just simple math. That never changes. You may not understand the calculus, but the math never changes. So when Paul says, look, I got a lot to tell you, Peter says he says a lot of things hard to be understood. Our beloved brother Paul. A lot of things that the unsteady and the untaught are twisting to their own destruction. So those of you who don't like Paul, you're twisting his words to your own destruction. Or you're twisting the teachings that you don't understand, because Peter says our beloved brother Paul is teaching the truth, but you're not understanding it. But one thing that Paul says very clearly, the 2 and the 2 that makes 4, that anyone can understand, is we're not under any law. And he says that the law was a tutor that led to Christ. And he says that it's a curse and a bondage. And he gives examples of it. And he talks about the law which came in 430 years later after the promise. But when you start looking at things like that, oh, ye who want to be under law, do you not read the law? And he talks about the parables that are there, how the law was given to a group of people that were symbolizing stuff. When he says that the law was written on stone, he says that means your stony heart. That it came with a glory which is to be done away. But the New Testament came with a greater glory, and that Jesus had a greater priesthood, that this is better promises, this is a better... So we know all that, at least I hope. We'll start there. We'll start with the idea that the basic gist of what the New Testament is saying is that was an old, and this is a new. And then it goes further, and it says that, what is the old? It's an explanation of the flesh. because we start in the flesh and we end in the spirit. But Jesus says in the Nag Hammadi Library, the Gospel of Truth, he says, if the spirit came from the flesh, that would be a miracle. But if the flesh came from the spirit, that would be a miracle of miracles. Because you see, what he's saying is that yes, even though we are flesh now and will become spirit, then that must mean that we once were spirit already. Because it's one thing, if we're flesh, that somehow it'd be a miracle if we're going to become spirit. But it would be even more of a miracle if we could become spirit and we weren't already spirit to start with. That would be the real miracle. If we're going to grow to become and partake of the divine nature, how could the divine nature come out of just flesh? No, that would be a miracle of miracles. The truth is that we are already divine. And so that's the sayings of Jesus. And those are the sayings that are written in different ways in the Gospels that we have, the 4 Gospels. And many of those, Luke was probably a companion of Paul, and so he probably was influenced a lot by Paul. Paul was a great teacher, and he taught us that Jerusalem that then was Hagar, was Ishmael, was carnal, sold under sin, dying, in bondage with her children. So, looking then at the Old Testament, we say, all right, so we should be able to go back to the Old Testament and read about this angry God and realize right away that that's just a parable about the ego, and that it's, he's coming down on this mountain, he's very angry. And we've already talked about how, yesterday, we talked about a little more detail. Like, it's not just the parables teach that, but literally the people that gave the law. There's a lot more to the stories that we haven't been telling each other in Sunday school, because you've got to look at this guy named Jethro, who's also named Ruel. You got to look at the etymology of the words and how they went up to Mount Horeb, which means light, and Mount Sinai, which means the moon, and how there are these 2 covenants, even in the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is that way from the beginning. It's just we didn't notice it. Genesis chapter 1 is a creation story. Genesis chapter 2 appears to be a creation story. Quite different from the Genesis chapter 1. Yahweh's not mentioned in Genesis chapter 1. Yahweh's mentioned in Genesis chapter 2. And creation is not mentioned in chapter 2, but a forming. It's a different word. He formed the ground, and he formed man from the ground, and he formed the animals. Form has to do with the lower carnal things. And then he made this garden and put a hedge about it. And it's as if Adam and Eve were already created in a spiritual sense on the first day. And they were told by Elohim, the gods, have dominion. There was no curse. There was no anger. There was no commandment. Don't eat from that tree. The New Testament says our Father in heaven cannot be tempted with evil. Neither can he tempt any man with evil. So that's not our Father in Genesis chapter 2, Yahweh. But if it's not our Father, then why? Well, I'm going to ask that question in a second. I'm going to ask the question of why. There's a couple of whys. But before we get to that, let's just finish saying that, so we've got this creation story and another forming story. 2 different creators or formers, shall we say. One of them gets so angry he stomps his feet and throws a tantrum and runs Adam and Eve out of the garden and curses everybody and puts us under all death and the curse, and in his wrath he says, you shall not enter into my rest. And then he turns around and makes a commandment that says, you must rest. Doesn't make any sense. And he says, he's like he's God, right? He's the Almighty. Well, he says he is sometimes. But then again, he's like, well, wait a minute. It would seem odd if our Father in heaven, the real Almighty, would get all angry and stomp his feet and come down and say, you will worship me, or I will kill you all. He doesn't do that because he's not jealous. Never is the Old Testament God, portrayed as this loving, wonderful, he never says, oh, I'll always forgive you. I'll never condemn you. I love you so much. It doesn't say it that way. He sometimes will say, oh, I'll forgive you if. But not until the third and the fourth generation, and I'm going to make sure that you pay for what you've done, and I will not by any means let the guilty go free, he says. And I will not pardon thy sins unto the third and to the fourth generation, and I am the God of vengeance. I mean, that's just not the way our Father in heaven is talked about. But, okay, so we've got that, but it's all the way through the Old Testament. We've got two flood stories. One with only Elohim, and there's only two that go into the boat, 2 by 2. But in the Yahweh Noah story, there's 7. Some of them, he wants 7 of some particular animals. And those are the animals that you would need for sacrifice, like the goats and the sheep and the cows. Because he wants his sacrifices even when they're on the boat, or I guess after they get off the boat. He wants to make sure they got plenty to sacrifice to the Lord. So there's 2 creation stories. There's 2 accounts where Abraham meets God. One is with El Elyon and his prophet Melchizedek. We talked about the higher priesthood. And one is with Yahweh, and he demands all these bloody sacrifices. And he doesn't promise that he's going to bless them. He says, I will bless you if you keep all these commandments. So it's always it's a different covenant. And this goes on down and down and down. And, for a long time, we just didn't know this. And then there were those who began to study the Bible and began to realize that there were these 2 versions. Some people call it the priestly version, and others call it the Yahwist version. Or some call it the Elohist and the Yahwist. So there's this Elohim God and there's this Yahweh God. And it's always Elohim or El Elyon or El Shaddai sometimes. And this God Yahweh says this to Moses. When Moses sees the burning bush, he says, as regard my name, Yahweh, I was not made known to your forefathers, but by the name of El Shaddai was I made known. So it is pretty clear that originally, and you can look in history and find that all those peoples down there, Jethro and the Esau and the Midianites and, the Arabic peoples and Persian peoples and Israel and all those countries, they all had the same gods. The Canaanite god El, same as the Hebrew god El, and they also had Yah, which in the Ugaritic texts, they have a different tense of Yah, and it's Yahweh. So we know that that's the same God. They had Yah in Egypt. They had Iyah in Babylon. And so they're all the same gods. And there were always the dark side of the wheel. The night cometh, and so cometh the day. The winter and the spring. Then there's the fertility. Most nations worshipped the higher, the God of the heaven. Some nations worship the God of the underworld because they were in fear of what he might do to them. Why, he's a raging, crazy God of the mountain. Why, he's on fire. It's a volcano. He's very angry. We better appease him. Give him sacrifices or he'll be angry. See, or other nations would say, oh, well, we got to worship the God of fertility because he gives us so much. We give back in return. Well, you say that's sacrilege. That's superstition. Well, obviously, because you couldn't write this story about the Garden of Eden, and there was a tree, and it was a tree of knowledge, good and evil, and they ate from the knowledge, and their eyes became open, and they became like gods, and then the God angry and ran them out. All this serpent talked to him. This couldn't be just some sort of history. It's obviously a parable. How is it that the nations who had this Greek mythology, myth, we understand that, myth, we think that means it never happened. Just a story. Well, perhaps. I don't want to get off into that. But the Old Testament, to modern minds, someone who's not steeped in religious tradition, would probably look at first glance at the Old Testament and say, well, it looks like it's written like a history, but it has all the same stories. Remember we talked about Jethro had 7 daughters, right? Well, these myths always are like that. You know, the 7 sisters of the Pleiades. They're always pretty much the same stories. We talked about once, I think, in one of the videos that I did, we talked about how the story of Moses being, as a baby, put into a little bulrush and set upon the Nile or whatever. And then he floats down the river, and the Egyptian princess finds this little basket, and there's a baby in it. Well, that's the exact same story that was supposed to have happened to Sargon of Akkad. They had the same story. The birth of Sargon was the same mythology, the same story we have of the birth of Moses. And in fact, the story of Moses is similar to the story of Christ in many ways, in his birth. There are a lot of similarities all the way along. I mean, I'm sure you've seen or noticed or heard that there's a lot of similarities between Krishna and Dionysius and Zoroaster and Buddha and all of these other great prophets and persons that have lived. They have a lot of symbols about their life that match and parallel with other people that have lived. And I want to talk about that. That's another great subject. I think I'm opening up a lot of can of worms here. But I suggest to you guys that does not mean that there weren't these particular individuals in history. I do believe that we have evidence that the characters in the Bible existed. But I think what happens is that sometimes these characters are born in lineal lines of the gods, and they sometimes will, either because of prophecy, carry out something that supposedly the gods did. But you see, the gods in that case there's 2 sets of gods in the sense. There is the original gods that perhaps are individuals that literally care for us, our Father in heaven and his Son Jesus and our Mother in heaven, and things like that. Well, in order to tell that story, they put it in the stars. And so every nation had knowledge of those stories in the stars. And so sometimes a nation would retell the whole story, because the birth of their nation was like the birth of the world for them. And it was the way that I think that the priesthood back in those days, I think they would name, because a lot of these people that you see Nebuchadnezzar, that's not his name. His name was probably Fred or Joe or Bob or something. But you see, Nebo is a god, and Zar means king, and you have all these Ra, Moses, Ramses, see, Amun-Hoseph, and Akhenaten, and these things like that. So a person who was a king would have this great title. David in the Bible, that's David. It's the same word. It's just in Hebrew, Daoud, which has come down in many languages, deity and day and divine, and it's Sol, Amon. There's that Ammon in Egypt, and Sol, the sun. So all of the names, Israel, Isis, Rael, all of these names incorporate the names of gods, because the gods are the stars, and the stars is the language, the 22 letters. It's all there, the 12 houses, the 12 hours in the clock, the 12 hours in the month, or the 12 months in a year. And all of this stuff is a great esoteric body of wisdom, a scientific language that incorporates all of the things that's ever happening. It's so deep that the wisdom that was originally put down in the pyramids is so deep that it tells not only history before it began, but it's got all the math and calculus and geometry you can imagine, all the names of the stars. It's got our history written in it. It's got the names of the gods. It's got, which is a sort of a parabolic story of our real father and mother, teaching us how they created the world, in a sense, with their minds, and they said, let it be, and it was. Teaching us the inner workings of the universe, and how all of us are like God, and we will also create our own worlds, but we're growing and we're progressing, and so don't think that these parables are just one thing or another. It's not just, certainly these ancient myths are not just stories that don't mean anything, and they're not just stories that mean one thing. They mean many things. There's so many layers. That's how comprehensive, that's how amazing the science is. So there were individuals like Sargon who may have, like a dramatic theatrical spectacle dawned on the world, they may have maybe even exaggerated something. Perhaps Sargon wasn't born in a bulrush set upon the water. Perhaps that's how he was known, because in the sky there was a story of someone who would do that. In the history of the world, there would someone come that would be this Moses, that would give the world the law, that would be a certain administration that we would go through for some long period of time, laboring under this schoolmaster. So he would be the great lawgiver. Well, perhaps before Moses arrived, there was somebody in Akkad that was doing that for them. Remember, you had Hammurabi that did that with the Babylonians. So, in a sense, that story of Moses is something that's very applicable to all of those cities. I suspect that the stories that the Judeans were telling in their country about how their Moses was a lawgiver, and that was their priesthood explaining why, because they weren't evolved enough to become free like children of God. The time hadn't come. The day hadn't arrived for mankind to go into the age where we awakened. So we were still in that time where those gods reigned. So perhaps when it says in our Bible that Moses was put into a basket and put on the water, we don't even certain that he actually was. But that myth, or that, I don't even want to call it a myth, we call it myths, but what I call it is that prophecy he fulfilled. Perhaps by some miraculous means he was made to fulfill the prophecy. Perhaps it didn't even require that it happened exactly the way the stars say it happened. Perhaps it did happen with Moses because he was the Moses that's written about in the stars. And I'm not sure why they thought Sargon was Moses, or they thought he was the person that the stars were talking about. Perhaps they were mistaken, or perhaps, as I said, perhaps what happened with the Jewish people happened in a like manner to some of the other nations. Remember, it seems like everybody, all the nations, seems like they started on a river that emptied into the ocean at the 33rd parallel. And they had their civilization along the Nile, what would be the Nile or the Euphrates or the Mississippi or wherever it might be. And they had their cities mimicking exactly the stars. So if their cities are going to mimic the stars, their civilization is going to conform to the way that our history has evolved from ancient millennia when we came from the stars. That it's all supposed to be unraveling this great mystery of this plan of God, the purpose that was in Christ from the founding of the world. That we were to come here, that there's a purpose for it. So each of the civilizations, whether it's the Hopi Indians or the India in Burma, the people from India or the Africans or the Druids or whoever it may be, they all mimicked the stars in their traditions. And so they had kings that were named that. Perhaps their original name that their mother named them at times might not have been. Maybe some important person in Europe came out and they named him, hey, little Johnny boy, But of course his official title was the priest. The great priesthood said, oh, no, this is the destined one. This is the Moses of Europe or something. And so perhaps they put him in a little basket and carried out a little ritual, and he did all those things. Perhaps it was destiny for certain people to fulfill the exact same things. Like, for instance, some of the people in the Bible, or different characters, they fulfilled similar things. Like I said, Moses did some similar things to Isaac, did similar things to John the Baptist was born in a similar way to Jesus, and they were just 3 years apart, or I should say 6 months apart in their age. And yet they were both miraculously born, and by divine intervention, they came into the world. So perhaps that happened in other nations. They had their Moses. But on the world scale, all the nations of the earth had all these gods and all of this mythology that was going on and their story that they're telling, to teach their people that, yes, you're just babies right now. You've got to go under the law. You're fighting and warring, and there's gods that are warring. You're worshiping the wrong God right now because you're too easily deceived. You're under the mesmerization of the ego from beneath. And so, one day, you're going to become all grown up, and you're going to be heirs of salvation. And so they taught Krishna, or they taught Buddha, or whatever. At that nation's appointed time, they learned about these higher truths. But in their history, they had, in their evolutionary process of that nation and its learning and growth, they went through the laws. I mean, remember, even in Israel, sometimes we think that Judaism is only the religion of Yahweh. That's not true. In the days of Christ himself, he was of the mystery schools. They were in the desert. John the Baptist and his Essenes and the followers of the Nazarene, they were teaching greater, more amazing teachings. They understood that there was a God of light. So it wasn't just like everybody down there believed that way. There were the therapeutae, the healers. They had different beliefs. There were those who were vegetarians. There were those who were zealous for the law. So in every nation, if you're going to, today we think, oh, well, over there in the East, they were so wise. They understand, enlightenment, and they believe in nirvana and all this. But, they didn't have evil gods and terrible kings and bloodshed. Well, yes, they did. Most of the ancient kingdoms went out in war, and they went out in the name of the god beneath, conquering in the name of the devil or something. Especially in ancient times when human beings were involved in idolatry, because they began to see the stories, and they idolatrized them, and they made statues, and they began to worship them. And the ignorant probably thought that all of these ancient stories were true. Maybe I don't know that any cognizant human being would really believe that these ancient stories were true, but look at Christianity today, that believe that Jesus is coming out of the sky on a horse with wings, and the people are going to come up in the resurrection, claw their way up out of the ground, and they believe this. They believe that we're all going to get raptured and just take off, and our clothes will just fall off down to the ground, and we'll just go out one day, and all these clothes will be purses and keys and credit cards, and be laying all over the ground. It's like, where'd these people go? Ain't nobody in their house. And people believe that. They can't understand what that would mean other than some literal interpretation there in the book of Revelation. There's going to be the beast, and he's going to have 7 heads, and some guy that's going to be all ugly like a beast is going to rule the world. And they believe that. They don't understand the spiritual significance of any of it. And there were always idolaters, as there were in every nation. So I'm sure the Edomites had idolaters, and I'm sure there were very wise Edomites like Eliphaz the Temanite that we talked about yesterday that was talking to Job, but yet he didn't know the answer. Why is there human suffering? Because even the greatest of the priests from the time, I'm sure Aristotle debated this. He didn't know. Why is there suffering? That's what we've been trying to figure out. But they had these mysteries, and it was once and for all delivered unto the apostles. So we read in Paul some of the mysteries. He says, notice how I know the mysteries. And he talked about, I speak of Christ and his church. But he's referring to this thing called the wedding of a man and a woman. That was an institution, sort of a ritualistic ceremony. But it's nothing. It's not important. It's the letter of the law brings slavery and death. But what it represented is the fact that we're all under slavery. When all the children of Israel went to the mount, they first went to Mount Horeb, and they didn't receive the light. It says that of course, our Father in heaven is not going to come down to the earth. No one can see him or hear his voice, Jesus said. So he sent his angel. And the angel is spoken of there as the anger of the Lord, so he's called Yahweh, but is he Yahweh? Because this is the problem we have when we're looking at the Bible. We pretty much discussed pretty well, and I want to get into some more of that. Some of the history going up to through the kings and judges. I want to get into, I guess we're going to do another video tomorrow, because I've got into some of the philosophy in this video, but tomorrow I want to get into probably Elijah, Yah. So he's got El and Yah in his name. He's not, is he a prophet of Yah, or is he a prophet of El? Because he goes and he says, why are you limping upon two opinions? If Baal be God, then worship ye him. Or if Yahweh be God. So it seems like he's worshiping Yahweh. But then, so he's asking, who's going to answer me? Who's going to bring fire down out of the sky and take the sacrifice? Well, first of all, would our Father in heaven really want a sacrifice like that? Well, Baal didn't answer. There's some interesting points, and I'm not going to give you the answers in this video, because I'm going to save that for tomorrow. Baal corresponds to Enlil in Babylon, as well as Baal. Enlil is called Bel, or Baal, interchangeably. But also, Bel was always considered, or Baal is always considered, a parallel of Zeus. And Zeus, of course, is in the sky. Baal was a sky god, a fertility god, of dew and rain and heaven. A god of heaven, not a god of the earth or below or beneath. Yahweh was considered either a mountain god on his mountain and his wrath, or beneath in the sea, the underworld. In the New Testament, he says your God is from beneath. We don't know if he means down in hell or just beneath on the earth, but not in heaven. There's some, we can get into that too. But so Baal was a fertility god of spring and rebirth and resurrection. So it's not, and like we talked about how Baal, or Baalim, plural, was a true prophet. Ruel was a high priest, and then he had the name Yathro. Jacob had Jacob. Jacob wrestled with angels, and we listened to all of his stories. It sounds so amazing. He's like a hero, but yet he's of the flesh. That's not the new covenant. It took him a long time to wake up. He stole the birthright. That's not the way to go about it. There's a lot in there that we haven't understood. That it's not explaining the New Testament in the Old Testament. It's explaining the Old Testament. It's explaining the flesh. It's explaining the wrathful God. So you look at the book of Isaiah and you see this God Yahweh, and yet he sometimes he's nice a little bit, you know. At the very end, he says in 66 of Isaiah, he says, I'm going to give you paradise. I'm going to redeem you. But you're going to keep my Sabbaths, and I'm going to make a new kingdom. And then you're all going to worship me. And those who don't worship me, I'm going to murder. And the only ones that's going to be left on the earth are people who are nice and you know. But he said some weird things like, who told you to come and trample my courts? Who told you to make all these sacrifices? I don't understand this. We got the same perplexing thing in Acts chapter 7 where it says that they were carrying their tent of their God, the star of Raphadim, Molech. Acts chapter 7 says that Yahweh is Molech. But we said that Molech is something else. Melchizedek has the name Molech in it. There's a lot to be understood that we're going to have to crack. We're going to have to figure out. But clearly, very clearly, the New Testament says in Acts chapter 7 that they carried the tent of Molech. Now we know that the Israelites did not carry two tents. They had one tent. So something happened from the time that they went up to the mountain of light, Horeb, to the time that they went to Sinai, which we can show and prove is Ishmael or Esau, the Mount of Seir. And we can show that Jethro gave Moses his wife Zipporah, who was a high priest, which Moses was a shepherd of Jethro's sheep, that Moses got the priesthood from Jethro, who was a Canaanite. We talked about all of that. So they get up to this mountain. They rejected the mountain of light. And they get up and they wander around and they're hungry and they're thirsty and they're complaining. And finally it says the anger of Yahweh was aroused, and he started murdering them and killing them all. That doesn't sound like our Father. So what happened? Well, there's symbolisms there that you have to be able to understand and take note of. That word, I am, it's not always a bad word. Jesus says, I am the true I am. I am the life. I am the truth. I am the way. No man comes to the Father but by me. I am the I am. The first and last, the beginning and the end. But Yahweh claims to be the same thing. I am God and there is none else besides me. There is no God. I am the only Savior. Everyone shall know my name. And remember what Jesus says. I've come in my Father's name. My Father's name. But when he comes, he'll come in his own name. And you will receive him. They do receive that. The world will receive that. The world believes in judgment and prisons and execution and justice and vengeance. They will not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. And they don't understand that when the people rejected the light and Moses veiled his face because their hearts were stony and they wouldn't be sealed in their forehead with the Holy Spirit, but they had to have their mark written upon their hand or their forehead, which is the law, written upon their stony hearts. And remember, it was God who was invisible, who was trying to get to know them, to love them. He was in the temple, the Shekinah glory. They couldn't even look upon it. So they veiled it. How come they couldn't look upon it? Because he's love. And the people weren't loving. They couldn't grasp love. They couldn't receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. So what happened? Moses put a veil. Made this intricate pattern. Make sure you do everything we say according to the pattern, the angel said. And he wrote with his finger, with his form. But Jesus said, you've never seen my Father. You've never seen him, never heard his voice. Those 10 words, that's not my Father's words. My Father dwells in unapproachable lights, love. He's the Holy Spirit. It's a seal upon your forehead. It's it's the Holy Spirit that is going to be with you and teach you all things. You don't need a man to teach you. You don't need these laws. You don't need Moses. You have one that condemns you, and that is Moses. I came to give you love and life, and that more abundantly. I don't condemn you. Love is something that's totally different. But you see, you didn't receive the love. You had to have it veiled. And then what? Well, the anger of this angel who began to think that he was God. And so, when people saw him, he claimed to be I am. In a sense, he was. He had power. He was given power over the earth. The ego has a lot of power, but how does it get that power? Well, the ego thinks he's God. The ego doesn't even believe in the spirit. The ego doesn't even know there's a spiritual world. The ego doesn't understand love, the principles of good and happiness and love and joy and kindness and curtsies and nice, and all it knows is an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, jealousy, I'm angry, I'm mad, and I'm going to get justice. So he believes I am God and there is none else. He believes it. He's the ego. And he says, I am Yahweh, but he's not. See, Yahweh says, I am, but then what's he finish I am with? I am vengeance. I am jealous, and that is my name. And we know in the New Testament, our Father is love. And 1 Corinthians 13:1 says, or 1 Corinthians 13 says, somewhere in there, like verse 4 or something, says that love does not get jealous, get puffed up with pride. It never fails, but it doesn't get jealous, and it doesn't keep account of sin or keep account of all the injuries or the sins or the mistakes. Our Father doesn't sit around keeping account of all your sins. He just loves you. He just forgives you. He lets the rain come down on the heads of all the people, whether they're wicked or righteous. The sunshine comes down and everybody receives. He's loving. He's good. He's impartial, it says. God is impartial. But that God who came to deliver the message of light, but the people couldn't grasp it, the anger of the Lord, like it says in Chronicles, the Satan, right, the wrath said, he had to throw down his staff and it became a serpent, right? His power was in his staff, that big stick. They wouldn't receive our Father in heaven, so he threw down his stick and he says, now, you worship that. Because that's what you want. They refused to receive. They went out and made a calf, a golden calf, and they put it in the fire and it came out a calf. So they got down and they worshipped it. It's a symbol, guys. It's a symbol. That bull on, Wall Street, that's what we worship. But it's true. We do worship our bellies. So if you're worshiping your belly, you're not ready to receive the light. You're not ready to walk out and say, I'm just going to trust God and be always honest and love everybody. And you know what? I'd give up my job, everything, and trust in the Lord and trust in love. We can't. So we steal and we bicker and we bite and we fight. We trust in the almighty dollar. And the Israelites did the same thing. And that's how we got the law. And that's why the entire Old Testament seems to be saying so many contradictory things. I create light and I create darkness. In his egotistical, mind, the whole nation of Israel couldn't have followed the devil in everything. Even their concept of the ego sometimes has good things to say. You can go up to a tyrant and say, can I have a day off? And ever so often they'll go, you know what? Go ahead and take a day off. You know what? Probably because they know that if they push you too far, you're going to die, and they need you. So they're going to make some concessions for you. Yeah, I'm going to make a paradise for you guys and redeem everybody that obeys me and does my will. Oh yeah, I'm going to redeem you guys one day. And you're going to all have paradise. But you'll have to keep my Sabbaths. And those who don't their bones will be strewn across the great valleys and the mountains. But so we'll get into the interpretation of Isaiah and many other verses in the Bible. because I think we may have to do one or two more of these videos, because, I mean, this is an endless search and quest for the actual truth. But we know that the Old Testament has got symbols in it that is telling us that that angel who was on that mountain, who said he was the I Am, wasn't really. It was the ego, and the ego is a deceiver, and he thinks he's the I Am. And so we've got to understand from there, taking it from that point of view, and everything we've already gotten to up to this point, with Jethro and the Canaanites, and how that whole story is a deep parable about mankind being fooled by the ego, thinking it was God. And then Christ coming, that great Logos, the one who reveals the Father, and says, you guys, you're worshiping the wrong God. And the apostles who came and said, these are mysteries, ye who want to be under law. Do you not understand the law? It's written in mysteries, guys. So let us, I intended to go deeper into some of these verses, and because I want to get into tomorrow, especially into Elijah and Jezebel and what that whole thing was about, because Elijah goes up to Mount Horeb too, and he finds out that not only does Baal not answer, but neither does Yahweh. There he was on Mount Horeb. Okay, he had to travel for many days. It was a long journey. The angel had to feed him along the way because he couldn't make the journey. It's a long ways, friends, to get to the truth. It takes a lot of work to figure this out. And the great prophet Elijah, who was just demanding that everybody make a decision and find out what God they worship, he finds out a great lesson because he goes up to the mountain of light. It's a long struggle. And he gets to the mountain and he falls asleep. And then there's a wind that comes up, a great storm, and God's not in the storm. And then an earthquake, and God's not in the earthquake. And then there's this great fire. These represents the judgments and the commotions and the physical things that's going on, and the wars and all the, the learning and all the bickering and all the studies and everything you could imagine. God's not in any of that. Yeah, that Yahweh who says, I am a raging fire, a consuming fire, I am God and I am vengeance, that's not God. He just thinks he's God. All that commotion and all that rigmarole. You can get deceived by it, though. The fire coming down out of heaven and sucking up the sacrifices, right? But Elijah found that God was in a still small voice within you. Because after the wind and after the earthquake and the fire, he heard God finally in a still small voice within him. It's hard to hear. You gotta be quiet. It's the Holy Spirit. It's not the law. It's not the fire. It's not the judgments. It's the love of God within you. So we'll talk about this again tomorrow, guys. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.